Hello, you sentient ball of stardust. My name is Casey Davis. I'm a therapist and I'm an author of the book How to Keep House While Drowning, where I talk about ways to make it a little bit easier to take care of yourself when you're overwhelmed, stressed, have mental health issues, physical health issues, or maybe you're just in a hard season of life. Maybe you're looking for a place that you can come and listen to some practical advice. This is a podcast for all of the self-help rejects. We're going to talk about skills for survival and self-kindness. And I'm going to leave the pop psychology at the door. I promise not to tell you to meditate or to journal. We're just going to give you some really insightful conversations with hopefully some practical advice. So I don't believe you need to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. I don't want you to just try harder, and I don't believe that laziness exists. So join me over on Struggle Care, where we can find compassionate solutions that help us function a little bit better.
You probably know the feeling. Sweaty, fast breathing, quick heart rate. That's a cortisol spike. It feels awful, and its imbalance is the cause of your anxiety. Rebalance Health's 3-part anxiety system helps address it at the root. Rebalance Health lozenges are natural and designed for optimal absorption, providing 24-hour relief. Live life fully without feeling like you're fighting for it. Get 50% off your first month with code CALM23 at rebalancehealth.com.
Stoveleg Media, igniting conversation.
Happy Halloween, witches. I'm Elena Grace, your host, and you're listening to I've Been Thinking. Today, I come to you bearing gifts of knowledge, gifts of wisdom, gifts of the history of Halloween. Now, as most of us know, Halloween is celebrated on October 31st every year. But you may not know the origins of the traditions that make up Halloween as we know it today. Halloween originated from the ancient Celtic festival of Samhain, where bonfires were lit and costumes were worn to ward off the bad spirits as the Celts entered their new year, which they actually celebrated on November 1st. This marked the official end of summer and the harvest, and the beginning of the dark and the cold months. Now, winter for the Celts was associated with human death, right? So this day, their New Year's night, was believed to be the day of the year when the boundary between the worlds, the veil between the living and the dead and the other realms, became blurred. The veil is the thinnest, I was always taught. So on the night of Samhain, the Celts believed that the ghosts of the dead and otherworldly creatures, like the fair folk, were able to come to Earth. Now, a fun fact for you, really quick. I learned in Ireland itself from an Irishman that in Gaelic, so it's spelled Samhain, right? The Gaelic word for Halloween. Well, for the holiday that we know as Halloween. It's spelled Samhain. And a lot of the time it's also pronounced Samhain. But I learned from an Irishman that it's pronounced in Gaelic, an old man, okay? It's pronounced in Gaelic, Samhain. So that's how I'm going to say it, because an old Irishman who spoke Gaelic told me it's pronounced Samhain. So there you go. But, if you think about it, it makes so much sense that Samhain in Gaelic and Hallows Evening in English were eventually slurred together in such a way that it became Halloween. The spelling, of course, like I said, is Gaelic, so because it's originally the Celtic holiday, so it has to be a weird as hell spelling. And if you pronounce it Samhain, I'm not going to say anything to you, but I'm saying Samhain. So anyway, the Celts wanted to ward off these spirits who were able to come to Earth on Samhain, to keep them from causing trouble and haunting them and damaging their crops, etc. But they also believed that the presence of otherworldly spirits allowed the Druids, which were essentially the Celtic priest class, to make predictions about the future, which was super important because of the Celts' reliance on nature. These prophecies gave them the ability to plan and hope, really, through the winter in a time before technology, when the volatility of nature was just, completely unpredictable, even more so than it is now. So they didn't want these spirits to stick around and attach themselves to them, but they knew that the spirits were important because that thinning of the veil and the spirits' presence allowed the Druids to read the future. So, as a way of celebrating and commemorating the New Year celebrations, the Druids themselves would build these huge sacred bonfires in which the Celts would gather, or around which the Celts would gather. They wouldn't jump in the fire, but they would throw crops and animals into the bonfires as sacrifices to their deities, because the Celts were a polytheistic culture. And like I mentioned earlier, they also wore costumes around all this evening. They were usually made up of animal heads and animal skins. And they, around the bonfires, they would attempt to tell each other's fortunes too, which is really cute. The costumes actually were a means to disguise themselves from the spirits, because they didn't want to be recognized as amongst the living, because then the spirits might follow them or attach themselves to them. They believed that the dead would see these masks and mistake them for fellow spirits. So that's really interesting. It makes me wonder what the Celts' images of ghosts were. Were they all animals? Was the spirit world full of bipedal animals? I'm intrigued. My trip to the spirit world didn't show me that, but I don't know. So upon the end of the celebration of Samhain, the Celts would return home. And it was tradition that they would extinguish the hearth fire in their house before they left for the night. And then after everything was over, they would come home and they would relight the hearth with flames from the sacred bonfire. And this ritual was meant to protect them through the coming winter. That is the coolest to me. I love that ritual so much. So by 43 AD, the Roman Empire had, tragically, if you ask me, conquered the majority of Celtic territory, right? Don't even get me started on that. That's probably a future episode. Over the roughly 400 years that the Romans ruled over the Celtic lands, 2 different Roman festivals were combined with Samhain to begin creating even more of the traditions that we know today, right? So first, Feralia was a day in late October when the Romans would traditionally commemorate the passing of the dead. And on a side note, I think it's so crazy that so many different cultures attribute celebrating the dead to the month of October. That's something to think about right there. The second Roman holiday, was a day to honor Pomona, the Roman goddess of fruit and trees. And her symbol is an apple, which, give it a few hundred years to mull over and evolve. And that explains the tradition of bobbing for apples, really, don't you think? In 609 AD, Pope Boniface IV dedicated the Pantheon in Rome to honor all Christian martyrs, and I bet the old gods weren't thrilled with that one. This celebration was later expanded in the 8th century when November 1st was designated by Pope Gregory III as a day to honor all of the saints together, or All Saints' Day. Very quickly, All Saints' Day began to incorporate Halloween traditions, as is so common with anything. And before you knew it, the evening had become more... The evening before became known as All Hallows' Eve and later Halloween. So, in just a few short centuries, from the time of All Saints' Day, etc., Christianity would be widespread into the Celtic territories, where the Christianity eventually blended with ancient Celtic rituals and gods. And many of the Celtic gods were actually made Catholic saints in order to make that transition easier on the people there, which is a really common thing. My favorite Celtic goddess has always been Bridget, the goddess of the hearth, the forge, and warfare. And she's still considered a saint to this day. And she holds some really important mythology, especially in certain areas of Ireland. And, that's really important because it maintains these ancient connections to your ancestors and your homeland, as well as giving you that connection with your within the sanctions of the church. Anyway, so the Catholic Church, later made November 2nd All Souls' Day, which was a day to honor the dead in general, which is today kind of believed to have been an attempt to supplant Samhain with a church-sanctioned holiday. And it was celebrated really similarly with bonfires and costumes and all that stuff. But it obviously didn't really catch on as a big thing, through the centuries on November 2nd. But it did make All Hallows' Day a bigger deal. And I think that then made All Hallows' Eve a bigger deal. So, they just it just all worked together, and honestly, it kind of backfired on the church. Now, remember, in case you've missed it, all of this was happening in Europe, right? So, in the New World, America, Halloween was very much a regional thing for a long time, right? So, in New England, it was not common at all because that was a very rigidly Protestant area. In Maryland, though, interestingly, and then in the southern colonies. And southern colonies makes a lot of sense to me because a lot of the southern colonies were heavily colonized by the descendants of the ancient Celts, the Irish and the Scottish, my family included. I don't know a lot about Maryland, so I can't speak so much to that. But in those southern colonies and in Maryland, Halloween was more common. But as the different European and native ethnic groups and cultures melded together, the American version of Halloween began to become more distinct, right? But it became more of a harvest celebration. And those included sharing ghost stories and telling fortunes and dancing and singing, which is very similar to the original version of Halloween. it's so funny how these things have a habit of repeating themselves. I really think that some things are just meant to be a certain way, and it is in our DNA to have those things that certain way, you know? But these autumnal celebrations were super common by the mid 1800s. However, Halloween itself was still a very regional celebration. In the second half of the 19th century, though, America was experiencing a surge of new immigrants. Millions of these immigrants included the Irish as they fled from the Great Potato Famine, which ultimately helped the popularization of Halloween on a national scale. Isn't that literally insane that the potato famine essentially gave us Halloween as we know it today in America? Like, if you don't believe in the butterfly effect, don't talk to me. That's literally proof of it right there. So, as we often do, we Americans borrowed from European traditions and we started dressing in costumes. Children, in Europe, it was a tradition for children to go from house to house asking for food or money, which that is weird to me, but I'll explain it in a second, okay? But this is obviously the beginning of trick-or-treating. And then on top of that, young women believed in America now, young women believed that they could divine their future husband's name or his face using tricks with yarn or apple peels or a mirror, which is very similar to the belief that the ancient Druids could foretell the future on Samhain. So, like I said, this is literally all just history repeating itself. Now, I'm going to explain trick-or-treating to you. This is super important, and I actually had no idea about this when I started researching. But the trick-or-treating tradition in England likely began with early versions of the All Souls Day celebrations, where the poor would beg for food and money and whatever, and wealthier families would give out pastries called soul cakes. They were just like very basic pastries from what I can determine, in return for the promise that they would pray for the family's dead relatives. So they'd say, I'll give you a cake if you pray for my loved ones and make sure that they get to heaven and out of purgatory. So, buying your way into heaven, normal. This was heavily encouraged by the church as a replacement for the ancient practice of leaving food and wine out for the roaming spirits to appease them and also to prevent them from entering the home, which is also really interesting if you think about it in terms of Santa Claus. Anyway, so this cake distribution, the church-sanctioned version, it was eventually taken up by children who, instead of begging on the street during the parades, I guess, the children would go out and go house to house, and people would give them little treats and money and little things, which makes it slightly less weird because you know about the development of it, but I still think it's weird. But then, I don't know, I don't think that trick-or-treating is that weird, so I'm really confused now, honestly, that I know the origins of trick-or-treating. I had never thought about it before and how frickin' weird it is. It is so odd. Anyway, moving on. Then, finishing up, in the late 1800s, there was a move to make Halloween more about the community and about get-togethers with your neighbors. rather than about ghosts and witchcraft and tricks and all that stuff. So Halloween parties became the most common way to celebrate, focusing on festive costumes and themed games and seasonal foods and all of that. So because of this, and because the communities and the media, actually like the newspapers and stuff, work together, they urged adults to remove the kind of scary and grotesque connotations of Halloween, and make it like a fun thing for kids mainly. So it lost a lot of its superstitious and religious underpinnings by the early 1900s, which then led to Halloween becoming a secular holiday, but still very community inspired and aimed, with trick-or-treating and town-wide parties and classroom parties and all of that. The trick-or-treat practice had actually fallen out of favor for a long time also, but between the 1920s and the 1950s, it was revived as a pretty inexpensive way of celebrating as a community, which makes sense because those were war times. So people were looking for little ways to participate that wouldn't break the bank overall. Plus, also though, the trick-or-treat moniker, you give them a treat so they don't play a trick on you. It was like tithing or bribing young people to not use the holiday as an excuse to vandalize, which is really interesting. Thus, the American version of Halloween was born and developed, and today it is the second largest commercial holiday, just after Christmas, which, wild. But the thing, so I guess two things stood out to me about this most, okay? First of all, my last name is Campbell. My family is from Scotland originally, right? And quite a bit of my family were amongst those original settlers in the colonies. And I'm proud of that, and my family is proud of that, and my parents have raised me very aware of my culture. And just knowing that Halloween was so important to my ancestors is really special to me. Like, it makes the holiday, because I have never been like a crazy Halloween person. I want to decorate the whole house. I need to watch scary movies all the time. I don't even like scary movies all that much. But knowing how important of a ritual it was to my ancestors makes the holiday more important to me, because I love having that connection to them. So I think it's really important to know, this history, because it could be a really important part of your ancestors' lives, your ancestors' culture, and you can make it, you can kind of revive them in a way through your celebration of it, right? Which I think is awesome. But secondly, I think it is so interesting that it began as obviously it began as a pagan holiday, but then the church kind of tried to take it over and blah, blah, blah. But it was secularized in the United States in the late 1800s-ish. And today, a lot of churches, especially I don't know, for a long time when I was growing up, which keep in mind, I'm 25, okay, I'm elderly. But when I was growing up, some churches wouldn't do anything having to do with Halloween. Like, they associated it with the devil and stuff like that. It was secularized way after the fact. Like, it was taken over by the church, and then community secularized it and took away the religious parts. So, what? I'm confused. It's just so interesting. My church had Halloween parties and stuff. My favorite 1 year I remember we had bobbing for apples, and I wasn't allowed to bob for apples because my mom didn't want me to stick my mouth in a tub of water that all the other kids had stuck their mouths in. So if that tells you anything about why I am the way I am now. But my favorite church Halloween party, I don't remember anything about it. But I dressed up as a little pink, like, fairy princess, and I was the cutest little white-headed little cutie girl you've ever seen ever. And my cousin that I hate now, she was dressed up as a witch, and it's just the most incredible, representation of who we each are, which, like, I identify with witches, but like green witches more so, not dark witches. She's a mean witch. She's a witch with a B at the beginning. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, I digress. I hope that you all have loved hearing the history of Halloween with me. I hope that my telling did it justice. And I hope that you'll be back next week. Thank you so much for listening. In the meantime, go check out our Patreon, subscribe there, and you can get extra content. Follow us on Instagram at I've Been Thinking Pod. Follow us on Twitter at Been Thinking Pod. I'm working on it, I swear. Check out our brand new website. The link is in the Instagram bio. And check out the blog that is now included as a part of I've Been Thinking. So every episode will come with a blog post to go with it. That is an attempt to be more inclusive, especially for people who have hearing impairments. So I really hope that that is helpful for somebody. And also my sources are going to be posted there as well. Y'all, again, thanks so much for listening. I hope you have the spookiest, best weekend. Celebrate accordingly, but be careful because there is still a global pandemic. And I will talk to y'all next week. Bye.
Hello, you sentient ball of stardust. My name is Casey Davis. I'm a therapist, and I'm an author of the book How to Keep House While Drowning, where I talk about ways to make it a little bit easier to take care of yourself when you're overwhelmed, stressed, have mental health issues, physical health issues, or maybe you're just in a hard season of life. Maybe you're looking for a place that you can come and listen to some practical advice. This is a podcast for all of the self-help rejects. We're going to talk about skills for survival and self-kindness. And I'm going to leave the pop psychology at the door. I promise not to tell you to meditate or to journal. We're just going to give you some really insightful conversations with hopefully some practical advice. So I don't believe you need to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. I don't want you to just try harder, and I don't believe that laziness exists. So join me over on Struggle Care, where we can find compassionate solutions that help us function a little bit better.
Are you struggling to conceive? You have options, and at Piedmont Reproductive Endocrinology Group, we'll make sure you have the guidance and support you need. PREG is known for individualized fertility care that's unique to every patient. We take the time to provide a reassuring and empowering experience because we believe that you deserve nothing less. Let us help you on your journey to parenthood. Visit us at pregonline.com to learn more. Get the guidance and support you need at Piedmont Reproductive Endocrinology Group.